So the problem is that the internet came to be in the times of ARPANET, when it was still called ARPANET. The whole idea was that the information can flow through different routes, right? To get from point A to point B, it can go through different routes, and that means it can go through different providers, it can go through different connections. In case some of the connections go dark, some of the connections get censored, for example, this same information can go through a different route. This is why there's this wonderful saying that the internet treats censorship as damage and just routes around it, right? But this is the case with all the layers of the internet, all the technical layers of how internet works, up until the application layer. So what I'm talking about now is, for example, if you connect a cable, like if you connect two devices with a cable, that's the physical layer, right? Then there's some addressing on the physical layer. And then if you connect to a router and then you have to connect somewhere else, you want to go to a website or whatever, then you have a different layer of addressing, and then you have another layer, etc., etc., and eventually you have this layer where you actually get the information you want, right? All the layers beneath are just transport, right? So in the application layer, the internet is unfortunately not decentralized, right? Because that was the conscious choice of the people that created the internet, that, okay, we need to decentralize the transport, right? But then eventually you want to get some information. We don't need to decentralize that. We don't need to push for the centralization of that. And what happened was that right now on this decentralized network, on this network decentralized on the technical level, as centralized services emerge, like Facebook, for example, right? You can have many different connections going to Facebook, but eventually if you talk through Facebook, you are talking through a single entity, and that means that censoring Facebook on the technical level, like in Turkey they were trying to, for example, right, by blocking it on the DNS level or blocking it on the IP level, there's going to be a way around that, right? But if Facebook decides to censor something or play along with censorship rights in Turkey, then suddenly you have no way around that, because this is your central point of failure, right? And we can see this happening in many other different services. There's also a different way the internet is centralizing. It's where decentralized services like email, for example, or the on the technical level, which can be decentralized, or should be decentralized, it is being centralized secondarily. So, for example, it's easier to keep one single server, right? It's easier to keep one single large service instead of different services. So suddenly we're all using Gmail, right? Even though this service can be decentralized, or we're all going through 2 or 3 exchange points in Poland, for example, right? Even though this could be much more decentralized, and suddenly those central failure points emerge even in decentralized infrastructure. Quoting Dr. Zoidberg, why not both? The problem with both governments and large corporations or large entities, let's call them, right, is not that this is a government or this is a corporation, right? It's about the power that a given entity has, right? So we are accustomed to, after all the history, right? We can learn in school about the history, and we are accustomed to be afraid of governments because we've been burned by them, right? We haven't been burned as much by large non-governmental entities, or we might not know about this, right? So I would say that we have to be afraid and we have to be concerned about any entity that is large enough or powerful enough to impress upon people its will, right? And governments have, with all problems that we have with different governments, right? Democratic governments still have some ways for the population to control them. With corporations, we don't have that at all, right? So I would say that this is kind of a balancing act between power of governments and power of private entities. And I find it disturbing that there are private entities like corporations that are in certain ways stronger than governments. For example, in an interview I was a part of in Poland lately, I've been asked, okay, so you're proposing this and that, governments should, introduce these kinds of regulations, okay, but what if Facebook does not agree? And for me, the question itself is preposterous. How can we be in a situation where a private entity can be in a position where it just disagrees to regulation, right? And the question is, of course, how would Facebook disagree? Would it manipulate its algorithms so that people would go out to the streets to fight their government? Would it use its immense financial resources to fight the regulation? That's beside the point. The fact is that we are living in a world where certain private entities, we are asking questions about those private entities. How will they react to certain government regulations, and will they agree to them? This is not the question we should be asking.
Okay.
I moved to Balkans about 2 years ago. It's a wonderful place. I really like Balkans. This word Balkanization has a certain flair to it. But answering the question, I don't think this is a hard question, actually. One way of answering this question is that the Balkanization of the internet is happening already, regardless of governments. It's just not happening on country borders or national borders. It's happening on corporation borders, right? If you are using Facebook, if you're using Google, if you're using Twitter. So for example, Twitter blocks Google searches. You cannot search Twitter through Google, right? It's a website. It has publicly accessible information, and yet you will not be able to search that information through Google because they don't like Google, right? So there are certain things where the internet is becoming balkanized in between corporations already, right? This is something that is happening. So using the argument, and what if it gets balkanized on national borders? I don't think it'll become balkanized on national borders, but this is not the problem that is happening. The problem that is happening is that it's being balkanized on the corporation, let's say, or private entity or service provider borders, right? And another way of answering this question is, as I understand the question is, we have a corporation like Facebook, and it's hard for Facebook to comply to all the different rules, right? I've been to a conference, I think last year or 2 years ago, where a nice spokesperson for Facebook was complaining how, actually somebody asked that spokesperson, so you're censoring stuff in India, you're censoring stuff in Pakistan, you're censoring stuff in Turkey, why are you bowing down, why are you bending over for governments, right? And Facebook said, well, it was a well-prepared answer. Well, we know, we are trying to bring all the culture, all the information that is on Facebook to people in India, Pakistan, etc. And if we have a choice to either bring some of it or none of it, then we would rather bring some of it, right? And my take on this is, blaming the governments for this is not fair, because the whole problem that Facebook has with censorship, for example, with governments asking it to censor stuff, is because it's centralized. Had Facebook decided to go with a decentralized kind of many different providers architecture, like email, they would not have this problem. Whom would the government then ask to censor? Who would the government ask, if you're using email? I'm sure that there are email providers in Pakistan or India that censor emails, right? But you can go to other email providers because of the decentralized kind of protocol, and then use them, right? So suddenly this problem evaporates if you make a different decision. And Facebook, of course, made this decision based on business requirements, so I have no sympathy for Facebook for this.
Okay.
So I believe that to some extent, perhaps yes, but this is not going to be as strong an incentive as a business incentive of running a service that you control entirely, right? The reason that we see things like Facebook or Google or Twitter centralizing more and more is because there are economies of scale, right? If you are running one server, or if you're running 10,000 servers, right? You can be cheap on certain things when you're running 10,000 servers, right? You can spread the cost, and have still, instead of having one admin for one server, you can have, I don't know, 10 admins for 10,000 servers if you work right. I mean, I'm simplifying, but there are economies of scale. So that's what's pushing the centralization, centralization, right? With decentralization, that would have to be a completely different model. You would have to rely on probably on user donations. You would have to rely on organizations keeping their own infrastructure to some extent, as with email right now, right? So the model for email kind of works, but we can see this centralization happening with Google, right? And I think this is one of the reasons I believe that there is a good argument for government regulation here, right? Because this is the only thing, and I'm not saying this lightly because I'm not a huge fan of government regulation, right? But sometimes this is something that's needed to bring in this incentive for organizations to not go too big to fail, basically.